Welcome to today's deep dive. So it is a complete sentence. It's just one syllable.
Right. And it takes, almost zero physical effort to actually vocalize.
Exactly. Yet it is a word that makes people so profoundly uncomfortable. I mean, we will literally offer a 20-minute rambling, sweating explanation just to avoid saying it out loud.
Oh, absolutely. People will do anything to avoid it.
Yeah. So today we are jumping into the really murky waters of the word no. And just to set the stage for you, the listener, we're looking at a stack of sources that unpack this whole behavioral paradox.
And it is a paradox for sure.
He says, usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem, there's this expectation of precision. Like if you break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line.
Right. The doctor points to it and it's binary. It's either broken or it's not.
Exactly. But the second we step into the realm of human psychology, boundaries and those interpersonal dynamics of setting limits, the x-ray machine just completely shatters.
It really does. It becomes so messy.
So messy. We are dealing with this incredibly complex landscape of fear, social conditioning, and psychological entrapment. So our mission today is to figure out why we are so terrified of saying no to the people we care about or work with.
Yeah, and to really analyze that agonizing space between knowing you should set a limit and actually doing it.
Right. And most importantly, to figure out how to reclaim our time.
Well, the stakes here are remarkably high. And it's primarily because the difficulty doesn't lie in the mechanics of speech.
Right, like we said, forming the word is easy.
Exactly. Forming the word no is trivial. The true psychological hurdle is living with the other person's anticipated reaction.
Oh, the anticipation is the worst part.
But it is. We are dealing with the fear of their disappointment, the dread of their silence, or maybe the anxiety that they might become aggressive.
We just build it up in our heads.
We really do. We construct this elaborate, often catastrophic narrative about how they're going to react. And that internal narrative generates so much anxiety that we just panic.
We panic and default to yes.
Yes, and then we spend the next 3 days practically suffocating under the weight of our own reflexive agreement. We basically trade temporary relief for long-term regret.
That reflexive yes is exactly where this gets so tangled. Let's ground this right away in a scenario from our sources, because I think it perfectly illustrates the trap.
Sounds good.
Okay, so imagine it is a Thursday afternoon at the office. You are already at your absolute limit. Your inbox is overflowing. You have like 3 major deadlines colliding, and you are running entirely on caffeine and sheer willpower.
A very relatable Thursday, unfortunately.
Right. And right at that worst possible moment, a colleague walks up to your desk and asks for help with a task.
Okay.
And the crucial detail from the research here is that this task is not critical. It is relatively unimportant. But before your logical brain can even process the request or, assess your workload, your mouth just opens.
You say, sure, no problem.
Yes. Why do we do that?
Well, that immediacy is the key mechanism we need to analyze. That's bypasses your executive function entirely. In behavioral science, we actually trace this back to the fawn response.
The fawn response. Okay, wait, because we always hear about fight, flight, or freeze, right? When the nervous system is threatened.
Exactly, but fawning is the 4th trauma or stress response. It is an unconscious appeasement strategy.
Appeasement. So we're just trying to keep the peace.
Precisely. Your nervous system detects social pressure, interprets it as a threat to your standing or your safety within the group, and immediately attempts to neutralize that threat by people-pleasing.
Wow. So it's essentially an evolutionary misfire.
It really is.
I mean, if we think about human history, we are fundamentally pack animals. For early humans, social cohesion wasn't just like a nice concept for a retreat. It was a matter of physical survival.
Right. If you were perceived as unhelpful or a burden, you risked ostracization.
And being kicked out of the tribe meant death. So we are dealing with a brain that is hardwired to believe that saying no to a peer is a literal survival threat.
And that maps perfectly onto the modern workplace. The office basically functions as a surrogate tribe.
Your brain doesn't know the difference.
It doesn't. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between a hunter-gatherer group and a corporate marketing department. It just knows that social harmony equals safety.
That is wild.
But this leads us to a fundamental cognitive distortion that the texts highlight. We systematically confuse being helpful with being available.
Okay, yes, I want to break down that distinction because that seems to be the absolute linchpin of the whole problem.
It is.
Based on the sources, we tie our core identity to being helpful. Like we want to be perceived and we want to perceive ourselves as good, reliable, team-oriented people.
Which, to be fair, is a deeply pro-social, positive trait. Being a helpful person is a character attribute.
Right.
It means you possess a cooperative spirit and you genuinely care about the people around you. Availability, however, is not a character trait.
It's not.
No. Availability is a state of capacity. It is an economic reality governed by finite resources, time, energy, and attention.
Oh, I see.
You can be a deeply helpful person who is simply out of resources at 4 p.m. on a Thursday. But because we blur these concepts, we fall into a trap.
We think saying I'm not available means I'm not helpful.
Exactly. We believe that declaring I am not available will be interpreted by the tribe as I am a bad person.
We think we are defending our character, but we are actually just ignoring the laws of physics. We just don't have the time.
Exactly. And the consequence of that, the reversal we see in that Thursday scenario, is disastrous.
Because we mess up both things.
Right. By trying to prove we are helpful when we have zero capacity, we create a self-inflicted wound. If you take on that colleague's task when you are already underwater, you are going to rush it.
Yeah, you'll do a terrible job.
You'll do a poor job on their project, and you will definitely compromise the quality of your own work. You fail on both fronts.
And there's this really harsh reality that sources point out here. The person who asked for your help, they didn't demand that you sabotage your own workload, right?
Nope. They didn't approach your desk and say, please ruin your Thursday evening, delay your own projects, and sacrifice your mental health to do this favor for me.
God, when you put it like that.
They simply made a request based on their own needs.
Yeah.
You made the decision to sacrifice yourself entirely on your own. You assume the burden voluntarily.
That is such a bitter pill to swallow. We make the decision to overload ourselves, but then we displace the blame.
We do it all the time.
We sit at our desks at 7 p.m., gritting our teeth, feeling like a victim, and secretly blaming the colleague for the pressure we literally just agreed to.
Yes, the resentment builds up.
But let me push back on this framework for a second. Because we are conditioned by every social institution we pass through, from kindergarten sharing circles to, corporate synergy retreats, that being a team player means stepping up.
Sure, that's the standard narrative.
Right. So if I look a colleague in the eye when they are asking for a hand and just say no, isn't that just inherently rude? Doesn't that damage the collaborative environment?
Well, that assumption that no is inherently rude is the exact script driving that reflexive yes. But we have to analyze the long-term cost of operating on that assumption.
Okay, what's the cost?
When you say yes, simply to avoid 30 seconds of temporary acute discomfort, you are not actually preserving the relationship. You are seeding resentment.
And resentment is toxic.
It's an insidious emotion. It doesn't dissipate, it accumulates. It quietly and fundamentally changes the way you interact with that colleague.
It creates a structural rot in the dynamic. Like, you think you are saving the relationship, but you are actually poisoning it from the inside out.
Precisely. Because resentment leaks out in micro behaviors. You start giving them shorter answers. You take longer to reply to their email.
Your tone gets a little clipped.
Yeah. You might even roll your eyes when they walk into the room. So consider the disparity in reality here. The colleague thinks, we have a great working relationship. They always help me out.
While you are internally seething.
Exactly. You're thinking, this person constantly takes advantage of me. You are degrading the quality of the collaboration, and the other person is completely in the dark.
They can't fix a problem they don't know exists.
Exactly. So addressing your pushback directly, it is not rude to say no. Saying no is actually a form of deep interpersonal honesty.
Wow, that's a huge reframe.
It protects the relationship from the rot of unexpressed resentment. You are always choosing between two pains: the temporary discomfort of setting a boundary or the chronic pain of long-term resentment.
We think we are choosing between being nice or being mean. But in reality, we are choosing between temporary awkwardness and permanent relationship damage.
Exactly.
But that raises a harsh reality. Let's look at the internal friction this creates. Because even if I logically understand everything we just discussed, even if I know I'm at capacity, and I know saying yes breeds resentment, if I actually manage to open my mouth and say no, I still feel absolutely terrible afterward.
The guilt is real.
It is physical. It is crushing. How do the sources reconcile the logic of boundaries with the immense guilt that follows?
They reconcile it by forcing us to reconsider the architecture of guilt itself. We are socially conditioned to believe that guilt functions like a moral compass.
Right, like if I feel bad, I must have done something bad.
Exactly. We assume that if we feel guilty, it is undeniable proof that we have committed an offense. But the profound conceptual pivot offered here is that guilt does not always indicate wrongdoing.
Wait, really? What does it indicate then?
Frequently, especially in the context of boundary setting, guilt simply indicates that you have done something unfamiliar.
Guilt equals unfamiliarity.
What's
Okay, that fundamentally changes how we interact with the emotion.
It's a game changer.
It makes me think of the physical sensation of public speaking. Like if you are about to step onto a stage in front of 1,000 people, your body just goes into absolute chaos.
Well, full panic mode?
Your stomach drops, your heart rate spikes, your palms sweat. Your sympathetic nervous system is screaming that you are in mortal danger, reacting exactly as if you were being hunted by a predator.
Yes.
But logically, you know there is no physical danger. A microphone cannot kill you. Your body is just reacting to the intense, unfamiliar stress of being hypervisible.
That is a brilliant way to look at it.
The physical anxiety is incredibly real, but the conclusion the body is drawing that you are about to die is entirely false.
And that analogy maps perfectly onto the neurology of boundary setting. If you are someone who has spent 2 decades operating as a people pleaser, reflexively accommodating others to keep the peace, you have built massive, highly efficient neural pathways for compliance.
It's just my default state.
It is your default neurological state. So the very first time you disrupt that entrenched pattern and say no, your brain recognizes a deviation from the established survival protocol.
And it freaks out.
It interprets that deviation as a threat. It sounds the alarm, and that alarm manifests as the crushing feeling of guilt. You feel strange, exposed, and intensely selfish, not because you did something malicious, but because you broke your own internal rules.
The mechanism is a misfiring alarm system. The feeling is real, but the data is bad.
Exactly. Bad data.
So, if I am sitting there consumed by this manufactured guilt after telling a friend I can't help them move their couch on a Saturday, what is the practical framework to navigate out of that? How do we override the bad data?
The framework requires a conscious shift in your internal dialogue. You have to stop asking yourself, why do I feel so guilty?
Why?
Because asking that question validates the premise. It assumes the guilt is justified and sends your brain on a search for reasons to prove you are a bad person.
Oh, I see.
Instead, you must intercept the emotion with a completely objective question. Did I actually do something wrong?
Did I violate a moral code, or did I just not give them what they wanted?
That is the critical distinction that many of us never learned in our emotional development. We have to separate disappointment from unfairness.
Okay, unpack that. Disappointment versus unfairness.
Disappointing someone simply means they did not get the outcome they desired. Did you harm them? No. Did you act with malice? No. They made a request, and you were unable or unwilling to fulfill it.
Right.
They are entirely allowed to be disappointed by the circumstances, but their disappointment does not equate to a transgression on your part.
That's powerful.
Acknowledging that someone is unhappy with an outcome without taking responsibility for fixing their unhappiness is a core tenet of emotional maturity.
This distinction that someone's disappointment is not proof of your wrongdoing sheds so much light on what the sources call the fake excuse phenomenon.
Oh yes, the fake excuse.
Let's examine this, because it is a universal behavior. You get an invitation to a dinner party on a Tuesday night. You have absolutely no desire to go. You are exhausted, your social battery is at 0, and you just want to sit on your couch in silence.
We've all been there.
But you cannot simply text back, I don't want to go. That feels socially illegal. So what do? We invent an elaborate fiction.
We lie.
We do. We say, I think I'm coming down with a cold, or I have to stay late at the office. Or we use the ultimate evasive maneuver, I might have a family thing that night, let me check.
Classic.
We fabricate these stories because we believe that simply stating a lack of desire is equivalent to dropping a nuclear bomb on the friendship.
We fabricate the excuse because we suffer from a massive cognitive distortion. We conflate the specific activity with the overarching relationship.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
We assume that the other person will interpret our lack of desire to attend a Tuesday dinner as a lack of care for them as a human being.
We project our own insecurity onto them. We assume they will hear, I don't want to eat dinner with you, and translate it into, I do not value your existence.
Yes. And as the behavioral analysis points out, that is a vast overestimation of the event's importance.
It's just dinner.
Right. There is a monumental difference between lacking the energy for a specific social engagement and lacking care for a friend. Declining an invitation does not mean you have reevaluated the person's worth in your life. It just means you don't have the capacity for dinner.
But because we are terrified they might misinterpret the boundary, we preemptively invent guilt.
Exactly.
We just sit there staring at our phones, visualizing their crushed, offended reaction before we have even typed a reply. We conjure an emotional crisis that hasn't even occurred, and then we lie to prevent this imaginary catastrophe from happening.
We are playing a high-stakes game of emotional chess against an imaginary opponent.
And we lose every time. The psychological toll of maintaining those lies is exhausting. The takeaway is stark: stop inventing the guilt and stop telling the lie. A clean, polite no is entirely sufficient for a healthy friendship.
It really is.
But let's pivot the conversation here, because declining a dinner invitation from a peer is one thing. The power dynamics there are relatively horizontal. You are on equal footing. I want to take this into a much more difficult arena. Let's look at navigating workplace power dynamics. Because you might be listening to this and reasonably say, this is wonderful advice for my friends, but I cannot look at the vice president of my division and say, I don't have the capacity for this project.
Right. The hierarchy fundamentally changes the rules of engagement.
The workplace is an entirely different ecosystem, precisely because power is not distributed equally. You are dealing with financial dependency and career progression.
In that environment, a blunt refusal can be career suicide. Setting boundaries with a manager or a director requires a highly sophisticated linguistic toolkit. You are not just saying no. You are negotiating reality.
So let's run a practical scenario based on the texts and actually integrate the specific English expressions they recommend.
Let's do it.
Okay, it is 4:00 p.m. Your manager approaches you with a new, supposedly urgent project and demands it be finished by tomorrow morning. You are already at maximum capacity mathematically. You do not have the hours left in the day to do your current work and this new project.
A classic squeeze.
A flat no is insubordinate. What is the toolkit here? How do you push back without detonating your career?
The strategic move in a professional setting is to make the trade-off visible to the person in power. You do not frame it as a refusal of the work. You frame it as an exercise in time management.
Okay, so what's the recommended practical expression?
You say, I can take this on, but I will need to move one of my other deadlines. Which one would you like me to prioritize?
Which one would you like me to prioritize? That is incredibly sharp. You are throwing the ball back into their court, but you are doing it from a posture of respect and collaboration.
Exactly.
You are essentially saying, I am a finite resource with a fixed output. Tell me where you want me to deploy that output. You force them to manage the conflict they just created.
You make it their problem to solve.
But let me throw the nightmare pushback scenario at you. You use that line, and your manager looks you dead in the eye and says, they are all priorities. None of the deadlines can move. I need them all done.
Yep. The impossible demand.
What is the play there?
This is the moment where most people fold, panic, and agree to work until 3:00 a.m. But this is exactly where you must hold your nerve, regulate your tone, and remain anchored in objective reality.
Which is hard when your boss is staring you down.
It is. But if a manager claims everything is the top priority, they are demonstrating a failure of leadership. Because if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. It defies logic.
So what do you actually say?
Your response must be relentlessly calm and diplomatic. You reply, I understand the urgency. Given the firm deadlines on all these projects, I want to make sure I am focusing my immediate attention on the most critical item first.
I want to make sure I am focusing my immediate attention on the most critical item first. That is bulletproof.
It is.
You aren't getting defensive, you aren't pointing out that they are being unreasonable, and you aren't refusing to work. You are simply positioning yourself as a strategic, focused employee trying to execute at the highest level while politely insisting that the laws of time and space must be acknowledged.
Exactly. You are forcing prioritization without ever saying the word no.
And this touches on a profound misconception the sources address regarding how boundaries are delivered. We have this mental image that setting a boundary requires becoming cold, aggressive, or combative.
We think it has to be a fight.
Right. But the most effective boundaries, especially in corporate environments, are delivered with a calm, collaborative tone. Boundary setting is an exercise in clarity, not combat.
That distinction between clarity and combat is vital.
And reading through the source text's analysis of our hidden motives at work, I was actually struck by a personal vulnerability. I realized I have fallen into a completely different trap.
Oh, what happened?
There was a time in my career when I said yes to a massive work responsibility. I agreed to lead a cross-departmental task force, and I absolutely did not want to do it.
But you said yes anyway.
I did. I was already overwhelmed, and frankly, I lacked the specific technical expertise they were looking for, but when they asked, I said yes instantly. And analyzing it now through the lens of this deep dive, I know exactly why.
Why was it?
I was terrified that if I declined, leadership would view me as unambitious. I thought they would label me as someone who couldn't handle pressure or someone who wasn't leadership material. I used yes as a shield.
That is a classic, highly destructive trap. Let's dissect the actual mechanism of your motive there. Your decision to say yes had absolutely nothing to do with seizing a genuine opportunity, right?
No, not at all.
Nor did it stem from a desire to contribute your skills. Your agreement was entirely an exercise in image protection. You were attempting to manage leadership's perception of you by adopting a persona of infinite capacity.
Exactly. And the painful irony is that the strategy completely backfired.
How so?
Because I was overloaded and lacked the appropriate skills, my performance was mediocre at best. I dropped crucial tasks, I was unprepared for meetings, and the task force just floundered. By desperately trying to protect my image as a hyper-capable superstar, I actually generated concrete, documented evidence that I was performing poorly.
Wow.
The yes achieved the exact opposite of what I intended.
Which perfectly illustrates the core reframing our sources provide for professional environments. Saying no in the workplace is not inherently a rejection of responsibility or a sign of laziness.
It's actually the opposite.
Yes, when executed with strategic clarity, saying no demonstrates a high level of self-awareness and emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
It actively protects the quality of your output.
Right.
Imagine if you had said, I appreciate the offer, but I cannot take this on and give it the attention it requires to be successful. That is a deeply professional statement.
It shows you actually care about the work.
It signals to leadership that you value the quality of the company's work more than you value looking like a superhero. It builds a foundation of trust. When a manager hears that, they learn that your yes is meaningful. They know that if you agree to a project, it will be executed excellently.
It is the stark difference between being a desperate yes man and being a trusted strategic advisor. The yes man is a liability. The advisor is an asset. But okay, as complex as the workplace is, it still operates within a professional framework. Let's move the conversation to the most volatile environment of all.
There you go.
Let's shift the dynamic from professional power structures to personal history. We have to talk about family. Because the sources are clear, family boundaries are an entirely different species of conflict.
Family dynamics are the ultimate crucible for boundary setting.
They really are.
The workplace has HR departments, job descriptions, and formal hierarchies that provide a structure for pushback. Family has none of that. Instead, family relationships are governed by decades of shared history, deeply entrenched childhood roles, unspoken expectations, and guilt that has been cultivated since you were a toddler.
To understand why it's so difficult, we have to look at what behavioral psychology calls enmeshment and family homeostasis. A family is an interconnected system, and systems crave equilibrium.
Right. They want things to stay the same.
From a young age, we are all assigned roles. The responsible one, the peacemaker, the troubled one, the quiet one. And the family system relies on you playing your role to keep the peace.
Yes.
When you suddenly set a boundary, you aren't just saying no to a single request. You are threatening the entire ecosystem. You are refusing to play your assigned part, and the system will push back violently to force you back into line.
That structural resistance is exactly why family boundaries feel like life or death struggles. Let's examine a scenario detailed in the text to see how this plays out in real time.
Okay, set the scene.
Imagine a family member, perhaps a parent or a sibling, expects you to visit for the weekend. This isn't a formal invitation. It is an entrenched expectation. They assume you will be there.
Typical.
However, you are completely depleted. You have had a punishing week and you are running on empty. Using the practical framework we've established, you attempt a clean boundary. You say, I really need a quiet weekend to recover, so I am going to stay home this time.
That sounds perfectly reasonable.
It is clear. It states your need and it establishes the limit. But unlike a colleague who might just nod and walk away, the family member escalates. They hit back with a sweeping emotional accusation. You never make time for us anymore. You're always too busy for your family.
That is the emotional escalation that breaks most people. The guilt spikes instantly, the weight of a lifetime of expectations comes rushing in, and suddenly you find yourself frantically packing a bag and driving 3 hours when you desperately need to sleep.
You abandon yourself to manage their anxiety.
Exactly. So how do the sources instruct us to navigate this specific escalation?
The strategy required here demands a high degree of emotional intelligence and verbal discipline. When they say, "You never make time for us anymore," they are expressing a profound feeling of loss or disconnection.
Right.
The instinct is to defend yourself against the accusation. You want to yell, "That isn't true, I was just there last month." But the moment you do that, you have taken the bait.
You're arguing on their terms.
You are now in a debate about your attendance record, and the boundary is lost. The strategy is to learn how to acknowledge and validate their feeling without changing your answer.
Validation without capitulation. What does that sound like in practice?
You hold your ground and you respond to the emotion, not the accusation. You say, "I understand that you miss me and I really want to spend time together too. I just cannot make it work this weekend."
I understand that you miss me. I just cannot make it work this weekend. That is a masterful de-escalation.
It works so well.
You are looking directly at their pain, acknowledging it as real, but you are not accepting responsibility for fixing it by abandoning your own needs.
Exactly. You do not have to argue with their emotional reality, but you also are not obligated to accept their interpretation of events. They're fully allowed to feel disappointed, they're allowed to miss you, and you are still fully allowed to stay home.
Both of those realities can exist simultaneously.
Yes. The core issue is our own discomfort. We want a clean Hollywood ending. We want them to say, "I completely understand. Please enjoy your rest. We love you."
Which almost never happens.
Right. When they don't do that, when they show genuine frustration or disappointment, we panic. We have to build the emotional endurance to tolerate the discomfort of someone being temporarily unhappy with us.
Building the endurance to tolerate their unhappiness, but we have to address what happens when they take it a step further, because the sources outline the ultimate danger zone in family dynamics.
The trap sentence.
The trap sentence. What happens when the family member realizes the guilt trip isn't working, so they escalate to the nuclear option? They look at you and say, "If you really cared about me, you would do this."
Oof. That sentence is pure emotional blackmail.
It is brutal.
It is a highly toxic, manipulative maneuver, whether the person realizes they are doing it or not. We need to dissect exactly why this is so dangerous. When someone deploys the phrase, "If you really cared about me, you would do this," they have instantly transformed a simple logistical request into a high-stakes test of love.
It is no longer a conversation about a weekend visit. It is a referendum on your character and your capacity to love.
Precisely. You are no longer evaluating your schedule or your physical energy. You are suddenly forced to defend your morality. The trap is designed to make you feel that a no is an admission of malice.
So how do you survive that without caving in?
The only way to survive this trap without surrendering your boundary is to completely separate the two conflated concepts. You must surgically decouple the specific request from the overarching relationship.
How do you perform that decoupling verbally? What is the specific response that shuts down the blackmail?
You have to address the blackmail directly but calmly. You say, "I do care about you very much. Saying no to this specific request does not change that fact."
Oh.
Or you can be even more direct. "My decision about this weekend is not a measure of how much I love you. It is just a measure of my energy."
Saying no to this request does not change that fact. It stops the manipulation dead in its tracks.
It does.
Because it forces them to confront the reality that love and friendship do not equal unlimited, boundaryless availability. If the absolute price of entry for a relationship is that you must always say yes, that is not a relationship of mutual respect. It is a hostage situation.
It reduces the relationship to utility. You are only valued for what you provide, not for who you are.
This brings us to a fascinating, highly technical section of our sources. I want to dive deeply into the linguistic analysis of boundary setting.
The mechanics of it.
Yes, because what we've been circling around this entire time is that the mechanics of a clean boundary aren't just about the concept of no, it is about the precise execution. The specific vocabulary, the syntax, and the tonal delivery dictate the outcome almost entirely.
Let's break it down.
Let's start by analyzing a word we all rely on when we are too terrified to say no but don't want to say yes. Maybe? What is the fundamental problem with maybe?
Maybe is the absolute enemy of a clean boundary. The issue with unclear, softened boundaries, using phrases like, "I don't know, maybe I could look at it," or "let me see if I might be able to squeeze it in," is how they are processed by the listener's brain.
We think we're being polite.
You think you are letting them down easy. You think you are softening the blow. But to the listener's ear, maybe is not registered as a refusal. It is registered as an opening for negotiation. To the person making the request, maybe translates directly to convince me.
Convince me? That is a devastating realization.
It changes everything.
You use maybe, hoping they will take the hint and walk away, but they hear it as a challenge to push harder. You are actually inviting more pressure and extending the duration of the conflict. You make it worse for both of you. But let's look at the opposite problem, which the sources call the over-apology trap. I am incredibly guilty of this. You type out an email or a text to decline an invitation, and it is a massive paragraph.
Oh, the endless apologies.
I am so sorry. I feel absolutely terrible about this. Please don't hate me. I really wish I could make it work. I feel awful, but unfortunately.
It feels polite, right? We are taught that apologizing is good manners. Why is this structurally destructive to a boundary?
It seems polite on the surface, but on a psychological level, it completely undermines the legitimacy of your boundary.
Oh, so?
When you over-apologize, when you write a sprawling paragraph begging for forgiveness, you are framing your totally normal, healthy limit as if it were a catastrophic moral failure or a crime.
Oh, wow.
You are communicating that you believe you have profoundly wronged them by simply not being available. And humans are highly susceptible to emotional contagion. If you act as though you have committed a crime against them, the other person's subconscious will pick up on that cue, and they will begin to feel as though they are a victim.
That is mind-blowing. By over-apologizing, you literally train them to be offended. You hand them a script that says, I am the villain, you are the victim, please be mad at me. Exactly. You manufacture a grievance where none existed. A clean, proportional response is all that is required. A simple, I am sorry I won't be able to make it this time, I hope you have a great event, is polite, professional, and entirely sufficient.
You don't need to bleed out on the floor to prove you are kind.
You do not need to flagellate yourself to prove you are a kind person.
Okay, so if we eliminate maybe because it invites negotiation, and we eliminate the novel-length apology because it frames us as criminals, what is the ultimate first line of defense?
The best tool in the box.
Yes. The sources introduce a linguistic tool that I genuinely believe is the most valuable takeaway from this entire analysis, the time-buying tactic.
It is the most effective tool for beginners by far.
What's the phrase?
The phrase is remarkably simple. Let me check what I have going on and get back to you. Or in a work context, let me look at my schedule before I commit to anything.
Let me check what I have going on. It acts like magic in everyday interactions, but why does it work so well neurologically?
It works because it violently disrupts the reflex. It inserts a wedge of time between the stimulus, the request, and the response. It prevents that fawning, automatic sure from slipping out of your mouth before your brain can catch up.
That makes sense.
But more importantly, it breaks a pervasive social illusion. We operate under the false assumption that just because someone asks us a question right now, we owe them an answer right now.
We feel cornered.
The time-buying tactic shatters that illusion. It creates physical and temporal space. In that space, your amygdala can stop firing, your parasympathetic nervous system can engage to calm you down, you can actually assess your real capacity, and you can formulate a clear, non-emotional response on your own timeline.
It gives you your autonomy back. It moves you from reacting to responding.
Exactly.
And finally, on the subject of language, we have to analyze tone and context. Let's take a very direct phrase. No, that doesn't work for me. Structurally, it is a very strong sentence.
It is structurally excellent because it is a closed loop. It does not invite argument. You aren't providing a list of excuses they can debate or problem solve. You are simply stating an immovable fact about your availability.
But the sources emphasize a critical caveat here. These exact same words can mean entirely different things based entirely on the tonal delivery.
Tone changes everything.
Like, if a colleague asks me to take on a project and I cross my arms, glare at them, raise my voice, and say aggressively, no, that doesn't work for me, I am not just setting a boundary, I am starting a conflict.
Right, your tone signaled hostility.
But if I maintain an open posture, offer a slight relaxed smile, keep my voice soft and regulated, and say, no, that doesn't work for me, it is received completely differently.
Completely differently.
Language is not just a collection of vocabulary words. It is tone, context, timing, relationship history, and intention. You can be incredibly direct without being perceived as rude, provided your nervous system is regulated.
That regulation of the nervous system is the absolute secret to execution. Humans communicate primarily through nonverbal cues and tone.
We pick up on the underlying energy.
We do. If you deliver the boundary while you are calm and grounded, the other person receives it as a simple fact of nature, much like being told it is raining outside. They might not like the rain, but they don't feel attacked by it.
That's a great analogy.
If you deliver the exact same words while you are anxious, defensive, or angry, the other person receives it as an attack, and their own defenses will immediately go up.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, let's pull back and look at the macro picture here. Let's look at the systemic consequences of all this. Section 6 of our sources dives into the economics of discomfort.
This is where it gets very real.
Yes, and I have to ask the hard question, the one that I am absolutely sure is lingering in the listener's mind. The theories are great, but in the real world, doesn't saying no actually cost you things?
It does.
If I start setting boundaries at work, might I get passed over for a promotion? If I start setting boundaries with my friends, might I stop getting invited to things? Doesn't this behavior carry real, tangible risk?
The honest truth, backed by every behavioral analysis in our sources, is yes. Boundaries are absolutely not consequence-free.
I appreciate that honesty.
We do a disservice when we pretend that if you just use the perfect phrasing, everyone will smile, thank you for your honesty, and respect your limits. People who benefit from your lack of boundaries will not be happy when you construct them.
No, they will not.
The entire concept of saying no boils down to a stark, unavoidable economic choice. Which discomfort are you willing to live with?
Which discomfort are you willing to live with? That is the ultimate trade-off.
Yes, because living a life entirely devoid of discomfort is not an option. You cannot avoid pain. You can only choose which pain you prefer.
Choose your pain.
You might lose the approval of a demanding boss, but you gain back your self-respect and your evenings. You might disappoint a demanding friend today, but you stop living under the tyranny of their expectations for the rest of your life.
Right.
You might lose an opportunity at work because you are perceived as less flexible, but you protect your physical health from a burnout that could take years to recover from.
You are trading one set of problems for another.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are trading chronic, soul-crushing problems, resentment, exhaustion, being treated like a doormat for a different set of acute problems. Momentary awkwardness, someone's temporary disappointment, or a necessary shift in relationship dynamics.
It is choosing your hard. Being overwhelmed and resentful is hard. Setting a boundary and dealing with someone's annoyance is hard. Choose your hard.
Beautifully said.
And I think this leads perfectly into a concept the sources called the rejection misunderstanding. We touched on this earlier with the fake excuse, but let's go deeper into the psychology of it.
Let's do it.
We have a tendency to turn ordinary disappointment into profound personal rejection. If I tell a friend I cannot spend my entire Saturday helping them move out of their apartment and they look visibly disappointed, my brain immediately sounds the alarm. They are disappointed in me as a person.
We internalize it completely.
But the expert clarification here is that they are not rejecting me. They just wanted something, in this case, hours of free physical labor on a weekend that didn't materialize.
Precisely. And when we panic at the sight of their disappointment, when we reverse course and say yes, just to erase that look from their face, we tell ourselves a very noble lie.
What's the lie?
We tell ourselves, I am a deeply empathetic person. I am saying yes to protect them from feeling hurt. But the psychological reality is much more self-centered.
Oh, really?
We are not trying to protect them from hurt. We are trying to protect ourselves from feeling like the bad guy. We cannot tolerate the physical discomfort of being the source of someone else's frustration. We are managing our own anxiety, not their emotional well-being.
Wow. We say yes to manage our own anxiety about being perceived as the bad guy. That is a gut punch, but it is undeniably true.
It's hard to admit, but it's true.
We use our exhaustion as a shield against our anxiety. Which brings us to the ultimate crucible of this entire deep dive, the litmus test. This is perhaps the most profound realization in the entire stack of sources.
It really reframes everything.
What actually happens when you set a clean, polite boundary and the other person gets genuinely angry, becomes vindictive, or walks away from the relationship entirely?
It reveals the hidden truth of the relationship. The litmus test is this. If someone only likes you when you say yes, if their affection is entirely conditional on your endless compliance, then they do not actually value you.
They don't value you at all.
They only value what you provide. They value your utility, your labor, or your subservience.
So by setting a boundary, you aren't actually destroying a healthy relationship. You are just exposing a parasitic one.
Exactly. Setting a boundary does not destroy a healthy connection. It tests it. It reveals its true structural integrity. A healthy relationship, whether it is a marriage, a friendship, or a working dynamic, has room for two people's needs. it can withstand a no.
And if it can't?
If a simple no shatters the relationship, it was never a relationship of mutual respect to begin with. It was an extraction. And ultimately, honesty is the only thing that protects real relationships.
Honesty over appeasement.
People cannot respond to or fix a feeling of resentment you refuse to express. If you keep saying yes and silently hating them for it, the relationship will die anyway under the weight of that unexpressed anger. Honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, gives the relationship a chance to survive, adapt, and evolve.
Honesty gives it a chance to survive. That is an incredible synthesis of the material. Okay, as we move toward wrapping up this deep dive, let's recap the core takeaway for you, the listener.
Yes, let's summarize the main point.
If you take nothing else away from all this psychological analysis, let it be this. The goal of reading these books, understanding this neurology, and practicing these linguistic scripts is not to immediately stop feeling guilty.
That is the most crucial point to emphasize. The guilt is a passenger, not the driver. It may not vanish for a very long time.
Right. You can feel intensely guilty. You can feel nervous. Your voice can shake. Your palms can sweat. Your heart can race. You can feel profoundly uncomfortable. And you can still say no.
You can absolutely still say no.
Because true confidence doesn't mean feeling perfectly comfortable and zen all the time. Confidence means doing what is logically right and honoring your own limits, even when every neurological alarm bell in your body is screaming at you to conform.
Exactly.
You do not have to wait for the guilt to disappear before you set the boundary. You just do it alongside the guilt. You take the guilt with you.
You have to stop letting an evolutionary misfire make your decisions for you. You can be a deeply kind, thoroughly helpful, and endlessly generous person without being constantly available to everyone who asks.
So, to leave you with a final provocative thought, something for you to mull over as you go about your day, think deeply about the relationships in your life right now where you are absolutely terrified to say no.
Think about those specific people.
The relationships where the very thought of pushing back makes your stomach drop. What if that intense fear isn't actually a sign of how much you care about them?
It might be something else entirely.
What if that fear is a glaring, flashing warning sign that the relationship is based entirely on your utility? The only way to find out if you are truly loved and valued for who you are, rather than just for what you do for them, is to finally set a limit.
It is the ultimate test of authentic connection. So as a final practical reminder, stop over-explaining. Stop writing the 10-minute apology for possessing a basic human limit.
Just stop.
Use the simple, clear language we discussed. Learn to tolerate the temporary discomfort of someone else's disappointment, and take responsibility for your own life and your own time.
Because if you don't fiercely protect your time, I promise you, no one else will do it for you. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration.
It's been a great discussion.
We started by comparing this topic to a broken X-ray machine, a murky, confusing psychological landscape where the binary broken or not doesn't seem to apply. But maybe, just maybe, those two little letters, N-O, are actually the clearest, sharpest image we can capture of our own self-respect. Keep practicing, and we'll see you on the next Deep Dive.